So I think we'll get started now. So hello everyone and welcome to this presentation by the Stoke and Staffordshire Growth Hub about the DIT's Internationalisation Fund. My name is Sam Beard. I'm the Business Resilience and EU Exit Advisor here at the Growth Hub. And as such, I kind of have one foot in the business resilience side and another foot in the international trade side. So before we get started, I just want to give a bit of an overview from a higher level as to what the DIT Internationalisation Fund actually is. So essentially, it's an ERDF supported funding pot. I think as it stands, there's about £38 million of funding allocated specifically to the IF fund. And that fund is distributed by the DIT. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Department for International Trade, essentially they're a government department that handle all of the UK's kind of commercial diplomatic interests. On the bottom level, they support businesses in terms of exporting and importing, as well as inward and outward investment. And on the higher level, they're out there negotiating trade deals for the UK now that we're out of the European Union and can actually negotiate trade deals on our own behalf. The fund itself distributes grants valued between £1,000 and £9,000. These grants themselves are match funded. We'll get into some detail as to what match funding actually is, but fundamentally, this is what the Internationalisation Fund is from an actual financial perspective. In terms of where it's covered, the Internationalisation Fund is distributed per LEP area. So obviously, businesses based in certain geographies will have a postcode, and that postcode will determine where your business is based from a LEP perspective. We are based in the Stoke-on-Trent and Staffordshire LEP area. Now, I should say at this point that the southern part of the county, so think about areas like Cannock, Lichfield and Tamworth, they technically come under the Greater Birmingham and Solihull LEP area. And unfortunately, as it stands, there is no internationalisation fund available for these areas because that funding pot has dried up. That being said, having spoken to DIT colleagues, they say they are looking to replenish these funds. But unfortunately, if your business happens to be based in this area, this kind of South Staffordshire area, you will not be able to claim for this funding. But as and when they replenish these funds, this will be a good kind of information hub for you to go about, I guess, utilising the information as and where that funding pot is refinanced. So what exactly does the funding pot cover? Essentially, it covers anything to do with international market entry and marketing. So think about things such as market research. So obviously, if you're looking to break into a marketplace, you'll need to conduct research into that marketplace, gauge the viability of it, gauge the feasibility of actually moving items there. That all comes under the banner of market research. And whether you do that internally in terms of market visits or by employing a third-party research company, the IF funding covers this activity. IP activities. So obviously, if your product is protected under British intellectual property rules and you wanted to trade in a place such as Brazil or the United States, areas where there might not be a trade agreement and where IP is not protected under the British system, then obviously this fund will help kind of bridge that gap and potentially apply for intellectual property, patents, trademarks, etc. in your target marketplace. Translation services, so not just translating of, say, manuals or labels, but also specific cultural translations. Sometimes words in English don't translate properly into other languages, so these services are also very important if you're going into culturally sensitive areas, for instance. Marketing, including search engine optimization, anything to do with actually generating interest around your product, the fund covers. Trade fairs. So again, if you identify a trade fair in another country, that would be useful for your product to be communicated through. The Internationalisation Fund grants can cover this particular activity. Independent market visits. So this is if you need to go out there, build relationships, build any of those kind of contacts to sell your product abroad or service, then the IF covers that. And in a much more broader sense, anything to do with consultancy in this area, like I said, activities that cover market entry and market research and viability and feasibility. What the fund will not cover, however, is anything in relation to production. So for example, think about manufacturing expenses, logistic expenses, fulfillment costs, anything that could have an operational element to it. The fund will not cover those activities. If that's something you are interested in, then I would suggest you have a look at UK Export Finance. What they do is they sit between you and your bank loan or any lending institution you might utilize to actually gain finance for fulfilling a contract, and they will provide a guarantee of up to 80%. So I would suggest going on the UK Export Finance website, having a look at some of their products, and maybe getting in touch with an expert there. But ultimately, that's a different product, a different service altogether. So that is the only thing through the DIT which really covers those kinds of expenses. Now, in terms of eligibility, who it's for, essentially it's for SMEs, so small and medium-sized enterprises. And according to this definition, that's a company whose staff members do not exceed 250 people. Its turnover per year does not exceed 50 million euros, and its balance sheet total does not exceed 43 million. When I say balance sheet, I mean gross assets, so no net assets. It's the total value of the assets in euro terms according to your business's balance sheet. So as you can probably gather, this is the EU definition of SME, not the UK one. If we compare that, we can actually see that the EU definition is a bit more liberal, because while the staff numbers stay the same, the turnover is a bit more accepting of larger businesses than this definition, as well as the balance sheet total. I should point out, however, that although this is for SMEs and any SME is eligible for IF funding, IF grants, the DIT does have a habit of preferring to work with companies that generate at least £500,000 of revenue every year. That being said, it's not immediately disbarring if your revenue is less than this. If you have an innovative product and that product hits certain kind of KPIs and success criteria that the DIT looks for, you might still be eligible in terms of generating market interest from abroad. I should also point out that your parent company, if you have one, must also be an SME. If you are owned by a large company, i.e. a company whose turnover is more than 50 million euros or has a balance sheet amount of more than 43 million, then you will not be eligible for it. If you do have a large company owner, then they can't own more than 25% of the company itself. I should also stress at this point that this is for new market activities only. So for example, if you are already exporting to the United States, this fund would not cover you if you wanted to break into the, well, if you wanted to do market entry activities into the United States. It would have to be a completely new marketplace. So for example, if you wanted to do business in Brazil, for example, or if you wanted to do business in Saudi Arabia, and that was a new market for you, then the fund could cover those activities. Now let's return to this concept of match funding. What does that mean exactly? So for example, let's assume that you wanted to break into a new marketplace and you wanted to do a market visit, and you've identified those costs at being £5,000. So everything from accommodation to travel to kind of, I don't know, entertainment or subsistence costs. If you've identified that as being the amount, then an intervention rate of 50%, and we'll get back to what intervention rate means, then you would be, the grant amount that you could take is about 2,500, and the other 2,500 would need to be self-financed. Also, the expenditure must be approved beforehand, so you would need to kind of identify what those costs prior, talk to your international trade advisor, and get those expenditure items pre-approved. You also need to self-fund the other amount, and because you're claiming the amount back after, you would actually need to incur those costs, before, like the total costs beforehand. So you would need to have £5,000 available, and then after the kind of activity has taken place, you would get half of that back, assuming an intervention rate of 50%, which is the amount that the grant covers in terms of total identified costs. Some areas have 50%, other areas, which are called transition areas, have 60%. So if you're in Staffordshire, then technically that is classed as a transition area. So you might be eligible for a 60% intervention rate. So for example, if the costs were £10,000, then the grant amount available would be £6,000, and the other 4,000 would need to be self-funded. But you would need to incur those costs beforehand. In terms of ineligibility, so there are certain disbarring activities, and it's quite difficult to put this all on one screen. So I'll just kind of summarize this in a very kind of concise way. Like I said, anything ops related, or if you're utilizing DIT services, generally those activities will not be covered by the Internationalisation Fund grants. In terms of sectors, I suppose it goes without saying, anything illegal would not be covered. And also any products that might cause offence or embarrassment to the UK government. So let me give you an example of that. The UK government doesn't support oil and gas anymore. So if you're looking to provide products exclusively for oil and gas, or even the coal industry, then that would be deemed as embarrassing to the UK government because that contradicts their policies. So that would not be covered. The same could equally be said for vice products, for example. And in terms of expenditure, anything capital or employment related, or anything that could be construed as the routine operations of the business, would not be covered likewise. So again, it's just those marketing activities and market entry activities that is really covered by this grant. And in terms of companies, it's quite difficult to summarize this. So I would recommend kind of reviewing what those sectors are and whether your business is actually eligible for that. Also, the de minimis regime applies. De minimis is an EU kind of state aid term, which basically says if the company receives state aid, or what could be construed as state aid, up to an amount of €200,000 over the period of 3 fiscal periods, then it's generally considered too small to be bothered by the European Union Commission. So if you kind of have already utilized any schemes that kind of contribute to your de minimis allowance, then the IF grant that you obtain will be deducted from that de minimis allowance over the last 3 fiscal periods. I have produced a PDF. You can contact the Growth Hub after this presentation to get some more information. That covers a bit more about the sectors that are disbarred, as well as some of the more kind of specific eligibility criteria. Now we'll talk about how to actually apply for this grant, because while we're talking about this through the Growth Hub capacity, it's the Department for International Trade that actually manages the fund. So in order to do that, you do that through your local International Trade Advisor, ITA. And you could do this by going to the Department for International Trade's website, find a local trade office, put in your postcode, and that will give you the details of your local team. Conversely, you could get in touch with the Growth Hub. We have a very close connection with our local DIT team, that is to say the West Midlands DIT team, what used to be the Staffordshire team. And we can put you in touch with the relevant party who will hopefully be able to get you through that process. But in terms of application, that must be done through a DIT ITA. Now we'll talk about the requirements, because anything government related, anything grant related has a great deal of bureaucracy attached to it. The starting point would generally be an export plan or a business plan, what you intend to use the grants for, what that activity is. So they want a detailed kind of agenda of what it is you'll be doing in terms of a business plan, and why you feel the need that it's relevant to actually go through this process. So what is the initial thoughts behind going into the Finnish marketplace, for example, or the United States, or the Saudi market? You need that kind of business plan to justify your actions, so to speak. Budgets, so anything relating to quotes, invoices, letters of intent, anything that kind of provides an audit trail for costs, because the costs will need to be agreed beforehand so that you can claim it back at a later point. And that all needs to be kind of confirmed by the ITA that that is indeed acceptable expenditure. So anything in terms of quotes and invoices, I would recommend that you keep a record of that so that you can produce upon request. Proof of your side of the funding. Like I said, you'll need to incur that cost before you actually claim back whatever the intervention rate for your business is. So this can be cash flow of the business. I'd recommend setting up a separate bank account to kind of have the funds in that area. You might want to kind of get the bank statement stamped by your local branch, just to kind of give that proof that yes, you have the money to kind of front your side of the financing, and also to prove that you can actually afford the activities beforehand. If you're taking out a loan, then an agreement in principle or some kind of contractual proof of that loan. And likewise, if you're going down the equity route, some kind of term sheet that will prove that you have access to the funds, essentially, when certain conditions are met. And also documents proving eligibility. So if you're dealing with certain products, you want to prove that those products don't embarrass the UK government, or they're within the kind of the acceptable parameters of this particular fund. Those documents can be obtained through the DIT. So the ITA will be able to advise you on what those kind of documents are, so you can collect them. And any information or technical information about the product itself, like I said, something that proves the product is legitimate within the confines of this IF grant. So like I said, I'd recommend that you actually keep a very, very detailed audit trail of every bit of information that comes about of this project. So set up a cloud-based system of choice, keep any documentation with regards to quotes, email correspondence, WhatsApp messages, anything that's to do with the project. And also it might help to get some kind of CRM system, something that you can actually plot the chronology of your activities so that you can reproduce that if needed to show that work has gone in. So maybe get in touch with your project manager or one of your project managers in your company to maybe organize something to capture all this information. Maybe it's belt and braces, but where this is concerned, it's always best to have more information than what might be reasonably required. I also want to talk a bit more about the higher level requirements. When you're talking about public sector procurement or grants, it's always good to write your proposal or to kind of align your activities with the objectives of the governing body, whether that's the UK government, whether that's a local authority, or whether it's the authority giving the grants. So it's always good to kind of review those high level objectives and weave that into your story. Things like firms starting to export, entry into new marketplaces, the creation of jobs, and also anything that fuels exporting performance. All of these are trigger words which can be used to kind of really sell your product in terms of getting approval for this grant. Other kind of hot words, as I would call them, are things like net zero, renewable energy, so things that contribute towards a positive element where climate change is concerned. Cybersecurity is very big. Anything that deals with securing things can kind of be that trigger word. And also made in Britain, which kind of goes with that term of global Britain, encouraging exports to all four corners of the world now that we have the ability to negotiate our own trade deals. So think about this when you're actually selling yourself in terms of these grants. Like I said, it's money being given by the government, but they want to see some kind of social benefit, some kind of GVA added to actually allocating this grant so they get some kind of societal return. And I should also mention at this point that these principles apply to all grants being distributed by the government, or even any procurement kind of opportunities you wish to bid on, especially if they're coming from the European Union, or even if they're within the UK itself. Now, because it's European Union funding, there is actually a timeline for this. Obviously, the United Kingdom has left the European Union, but we have ring-fenced EU funding until the end of March 2023. So after 2023, the Internationalisation Fund actually closes because it's ERDF funded, EU funded, so those activities will no longer be, applied to the British marketplace. So really what you need to do is submit all your documentation, working backwards that is, submit all your documentation before the 31st of March 2023. And the activity itself, whether that's market research, whether that's entry into a new marketplace through doing market visits or trade fairs, that must be concluded before the midpoint of February. So by the 13th or the 14th of February, that activity needs to have been completed. So from today's date, that gives roughly a bit more than 6 months of actually getting this going, getting started, deciding what that activity is going to be, determining whether that activity is acceptable, and actually going and getting in touch with the Growth Hub or the DIT International Trade Advisors and getting that kind of process rolling. In terms of the future of the fund, because as you can imagine, with global Britain and Britain's international trade aspirations, there might be a replacement fund in terms of maybe that comes under the UK Shared Prosperity Fund or any of these other kind of funds that might be coming out of Whitehall in the future. But we don't know what that is. We don't know what that replacement is, and we don't know what those terms and conditions are. For example, like I said, right now, because it's EU funding, the EU definition of a SME applies. But if this is going to be a completely 100% British fund, then chances are the British definition of an SME will be provided. And if that's the case, then that gives a much narrower pool of what businesses can actually apply for this funding. And the same also goes for what the intervention rate is. Obviously, this is based off the kind of EU GBER regulations. So whether the UK has a different one remains to be seen. That being said, that is probably the situation moving forward after the 31st of March of next year. And that pretty much covers this presentation on the Internationalisation Fund. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time. If you do need to kind of ask any questions of this, feel free to get in touch with the Growth Hub, either by sending an email to the inquiries or by calling the hotline. And someone will help you kind of speak to the right person with regards to this particular advice.